Hi everyone. So today is Thursday, February the 17th is when you're watching this video. When I made this video, it's actually Tuesday, February the 15th. Little John is doing well. We went home from the hospital on Sunday, but then we had to come back on Monday because he began running a fever. So that's where I'm currently making this video, but Lord willing, we'll get to go home on tomorrow, which will be Wednesday. So when you're watching this video, Lord willing, we're already back home. So we're starting off on chapter 18. This chapter has 5 sections in it. So today you'll do 8.1 and 8.2. Tomorrow you'll do 8.3 and 8.4. And then on Monday, or actually, excuse me, Tuesday, you'll do 8.5 notes before you review for your test. So I'm going to begin our notes. So we're looking at in this chapter, establishing our new government. So we have our Constitution. We have this new government. We have a new president in George Washington. So what now? This is a unique situation. Nobody has a government exactly like this in the world. So we are basically creating this government from the ground up. And Washington is trying to do the best he can. And he does a great job with it. I mean, for having no model to work off of, he does a great job with it. So his inauguration, which is the formal ceremony starting his term, began right at noon on April 30th, 1789 at Federal Hall in New York City. He placed his left hand on the Bible and raised his right hand to take the oath of office. He repeated the 35 words required by the Constitution. I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. And at the end, Washington added his own phrase to it that is not actually in the Constitution, but has been kind of kept as a tradition since then. And it was "So help me God." So Washington had a good reason to kind of be solemn on this occasion. The United States had only slightly fewer than 4 million people at this time, 700,000 of whom were slaves. Other nations were unfriendly to the U.S. and its new form of government. The nation had no money, lacked a strong army and navy. The Constitution outlined the framework for the new government, but it lacked a lot of the exact details. And this is what Washington is working with here. So we're going to look in this first section at challenging the new challenges for the new government. So as I talked about before, this government that Washington was in charge of was completely new. No other country had this exact kind of government that Washington and other leaders could look to. Part of his first challenge was setting up a cabinet, which would be a group of advisors that would help him with his responsibilities. So we're going to look at who were in his first cabinet and what their jobs were. So he had established 4 departments in his cabinet, and he placed men he trusted in there to lead these departments. So the State Department, known as the Secretary of the State, was headed by Thomas Jefferson. The Secretary of the Treasury was headed by Alexander Hamilton. The War Department, his title was the Secretary of War, was led by Henry Knox. This is the guy who brought the artillery down from Fort Ticonderoga and helped to liberate Boston from British control. And what became known as the Justice Department was led by Attorney General Edmund Randolph. You'll need to know these 4 departments and their heads, okay? He placed Samuel Osgood at the head of the post office. This was not one of the departments, but it was an important position. So since Washington, other presidents have expanded but never disbanded the cabinet he set up. So while we still have these positions, we now have more. We have like the Office of Homeland Security, just Office of the Navy. So we have different ones, different cabinet positions now. And on Washington's cabinet, while he advocated for everyone to come together, There was two completely different visions for America on his cabinet, particularly from Hamilton and Jefferson. Hamilton was a Federalist. He believed that there should be a strong government. It should be limited, yes, but strong still. Hamilton was from New York. This was the idea that was shared by the North. He was very much for industrialism. He was much for building up the cities. And then Jefferson was an anti-federalist. He wanted the states to have more power than the national government. He was from Virginia. He advocated for a more agricultural society, more rural society. So at first, the government had trouble paying government salaries. The government before was broke, coming off from the Articles of Confederation when they had no power to be able to tax. They were broke, so they had to start bringing up money. They couldn't pay their war debts that they owed to individual states, other countries, which was part of the problem that brought them to the point where they knew they needed something different than the Articles of the Confederation. So the government's inability to meet its obligations caused Americans to lose respect for it. So Hamilton, which was the Secretary of the Treasury, he came up with a plan to help the new nation pay its debt and meet its government obligations. So first, the government would have to levy or impose and collect taxes to obtain revenue. There was no way around this, but the way that they made it different from Britain was that the people had a voice in the representative government. Whiskey would have an excise tax, which is a tax paid on the manufacture or sale of certain goods and services within a country. Second, the government would repay the money borrowed during the war for independence. Third, Hamilton wanted to take over the responsibility of paying the state's debts. Now, some people like Jefferson didn't like this. At this time, Virginia had already paid off all of its debts. It didn't want to assume the debts of other states, And then fourth, Hamilton wanted to establish a national bank that could hold tax revenue in one place and its financial dealings could be handled through the bank. The major share of the bank would be owned by private citizens. So we're going to look at Jefferson's views on these because Jefferson pretty much disagreed with everything that Alexander Hamilton proposed. Sometimes I think he disagreed with it just to be contrary. So that a group emerged under Jefferson's leadership that opposed Hamilton's ideas. Washington had hoped throughout his presidency that there would be no political parties, but it just didn't work out that way. We're always going to have differings of opinions. And that's fine. If everybody had the same opinions and thought exactly alike, it would get rather dull and boring. So it's good that we have differing views as long as we learn to respect each other's ideas and opinions. The groups that formed around Hamilton and Jefferson eventually became the basis of America's two-party political system. Hamilton's parties were called the Federalist. Jefferson was called the Democratic Republican Party. Its members were called Republicans. Now, this is not the same Republicans that you think about today. They would actually be more the Democrats than the Republicans. So as with everything, you're going to have problems. And the excise tax on whiskey led to a problem that tested Washington and his government. So on the western frontier, corn was not only used as food for people and animals, but also used to make whiskey. Because of the shortage of money and the desire for whiskey, some people used whiskey as a form of money. Therefore, Westerners resented the excise tax because it affected many of their purchases. If a man bartered a gallon of whiskey for a pig, he still had to pay the tax on the whiskey. If he refused to pay the tax and were arrested, he had to go to a federal court for trial. The federal courts were sometimes miles away in coastal cities. In western Pennsylvania during the summer of 1794, angry farmers attacked a federal marshal who tried to arrest a whiskey distiller, which is someone who makes whiskey, for not paying the whiskey tax. The mob also burned the home of a tax inspector and tarred and feathered other official. Washington wanted Pennsylvania to handle the problem, but the state governor refused. So Washington offered these rebels a group pardon, which is amnesty. Amnesty is a group pardon if they would agree to abide by the law, but they refused. So the president then called about 13,000 militiamen out as a federal force. He commanded the rebels to disperse by September the 1st. Otherwise, the militia would move in. So Washington moved forcefully. He told the troops to combat and subdue all who were found in arms in opposition to the national will and authority. To increase the image of strong federal power and to show his willingness to deal decisively with the rebellion, Washington himself led the front units of the troops for some miles. When the rest of the troops arrived at the scene, they arrested a few of the rebels. The troops condemned 2 rebels to death, but Washington later pardoned them. Washington's response to this whiskey rebellion proved his commitment for the rule of law. He showed people that this new government was not just a phase, that it was here to stay, and it was strong, and it meant what it said. The rebellion's leaders realized that they could not allow their newfound freedoms to turn into lawlessness. Yes, we are free. We have the freedom to choose, but we are not free from the consequences of our choices, and we are not free to take away other people's freedoms. Establishing the federal court system, Under the Judiciary Act of 1789, Congress created a working court system. Part of that called for a Supreme Court. It would have 5 associate justices and 1 chief justice. Washington appointed John Jay as the first chief justice. Then ratification of the Bill of Rights. Well, you remember, some of the states only agreed to ratify the Constitution if they passed a Bill of Rights. So during the Philadelphia Convention, the delegates had discussed a Bill of Rights. When the Congress first convened, debate erupted over the Bill of Rights. So the states ratified 10 of the proposed amendments by the end of 1791. There were more bills of more amendments that were a part of the Bill of Rights to begin with, but not all of them passed. 2 of the original amendments presented in the Bill of Rights were not ratified by the required number of states. One of them concerned the ratio of citizens per representative. Had the amendment been ratified, Congress would have about 6,000 members instead of the current 435. The other amendment concerned congressional pay. It was finally passed as the 27th Amendment in 1992. Americans are getting set up here also had problems with the Indians. Americans, feeling the need to expand, wanted to move into the lands of the Northwest. But a lot of the land still belonged to the Indians, and the U.S. made treaties with many of the tribes concerning the protection of their land. Many tribes responded to the growing number of Americans moving into the Western lands as an invasion, and they began to fight for their lands. In 1794, war hero Anthony Wayne and a well-trained force entered what is now northwestern Ohio. They defeated a band of Indians and their allies at Fallen Timbers near modern-day Toledo. The defeated Indians came to a peace conference at Fort Greenville in 1795. They gave up their claim to about half of Ohio in return for gifts and annual payments. Despite harsh conditions and continuing threat of attack, more pioneers went west. During the 1790s, 3 new states joined the Union: Vermont, Kentucky, and Tennessee. All right, moving on to section 2, looking at the foreign threats to the new nation. These are countries across the world who had problems with the US and how the US dealt with those problems. We're looking at 3 different countries specifically. We're looking at France, Great Britain, and Spain. By summer of 1789, the Americans learned that the French had rebelled against King Louis XVI. The Americans cheered, celebrating the French rage, liberty, equality, and fraternity. They were excited that France, who had aided them in their own revolution, was taking this approach to rebel against their monarch, against the king, and to come out and have their own government. At first, Americans approved of these French patriots, but by 1793, Americans were horrified by what had happened in France. Things got really bad. We had the reign of terror, the guillotine, and all this that you learned about last year whenever we were studying when we were studying world history. So Americans were horrified about what was happening over in France. Lafayette was in prison and France was bathed in blood. The French government, although a Republican name, was highly unstable and citizens lived in terror. The French leaders campaigned against religion and removed all traces of it from public life. During that time, France and Britain became involved in a war, which is nothing new. France and Britain have been in wars throughout most of their history. But with that war, on April 22nd, 1793, Washington issued a proclamation of neutrality, basically saying we're not getting involved in this war between Britain and France. We are going to keep to ourselves. France can do what they want to do. Britain can do what they want to do, but we're not getting involved. We are going to be a neutral country. And he urged Americans to be impartial towards all foreign foes and to cease actions that would involve the United States in foreign wars, meaning just don't do anything that could get us caught up in their war. Let them fight their war. Don't do anything that would get the United States involved. One guy from France decided he wanted to test this proclamation. His name was Edmund Charles Genet. He was kind of troublesome. He came from France and went on a tour across the United States trying to drum up support for the French. He set up a base in Charleston, South Carolina, for their French land and sea operation against Spain and England. Washington realized what he was doing, that he was drumming up support for France, trying to make America go to war on behalf of France, therefore going to war against Britain and Spain. Washington asked France to recall Genet, bring him back, take away their ambassador, bring him back to France. Congress, in response to all this that went on with Genet, Congress passed laws to prevent other foreign agents from causing trouble. France did recall Genet, but Washington learned that if he were to go back to France, that he would be executed. So Washington gave him a pardon, and Genet ended up living here in the United States. He actually fell in love with and married the daughter of New York Governor George Clinton. He became an American citizen and settled on a farm near Albany, New York. So it ended up with a happy ending. The United States and Britain disagreed over what rights neutral countries should have at sea. So these are the rights what rights America should have at sea during this war. They were neutral. So who should they be able to trade with? Which side or the other should they be able to trade with? The U.S. believed that they should be able to trade with whoever they wanted to. They weren't a part of the war, so they shouldn't affect their trading. Britain thought they should only be able to trade with Britain. They invoked an old law, the Rule of 1756, which said that trade not open in peace could not be opened in war. As a result, Britain seized 250 American ships with their cargoes and crews. This was a practice called impressment. This was when, the impressment is when the British would make these sailors serve on their ships. So the British were angry when their own sailors jumped ship and joined American ships. So to replace their lost sailors, the British seized American sailors and forced them to serve the British. It was known as impressment. To avoid war, Washington sent John Jay, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, to head a peace mission to Britain. Now, Jay was an experienced treaty maker. He had done this hundreds of times before. He was a very diplomatic person, but he was in a bad position from the start. So he didn't have a whole lot to work with. And in the end, the U.S. agreed to limit trade with France, Britain's enemy, and to pay British citizens what Americans owed them. The British agreed to abandon their forts in the Northwest, pay the U.S. for ships seized, and open some ports to in the British West Indies to American trade. It didn't settle the issue of the Indian tax that the British were inciting out in the West. And it didn't settle any of the issues of the neutral rights at sea. Congress and the American public were angry about both John Jay and his treaty. Then looking at some of the problems that America had with Spain. Spain still controlled Florida and had temporary control of the Louisiana Territory, the land west of the Mississippi. The treaty made with Spain in 1795 gave the U.S. the right of deposit at New Orleans. The right of deposit is the right to be able to stockpile your goods at a port until a ship comes to take those goods to market. So Americans would send their goods and products down the Mississippi River to the port in New Orleans, and they thought they had the right to be able to stockpile their goods there in New Orleans until ships could come in and pick them up. And Spain is trying to say, no, you do not have this right. But this treaty that they ended up making with Spain gave the U.S. the right of deposit at New Orleans and made the 31st parallel latitude the southern boundary of the United States. It was done by Thomas Pinckney of South Carolina. So it became known as the Pinckney Treaty. And unlike the Jay Treaty, it was popular. And Pinckney became an instant hero. All right, so that is the end of section 2. So that's all your notes for the day. So you'll pause the video here and pick up with section 3 tomorrow, the continuation of the government. So now I'm going to go right into section 3, continuation of the government. So Washington decided that 2 terms was enough for any one person to be in office. So he set this 2-term tradition that was only tried once throughout the American history, and that's by Franklin D. Roosevelt during the Great Depression, the years following, and into World War II. He was actually elected to his 4th term of office before he died while in office. So Washington's farewell address, he was printed in the papers about 6 months before he left office, and it gave advice for the future. Washington was called by his fellow Virginian Henry Lee, first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen. He was our first leader, military leader during war. He was our first president during peacetime, and he's first in our hearts. When we think about America and the beginning of America, we think about George Washington. So he is first in our hearts when it comes to the birth of this country. The election of 1796, for the first time, had political parties. This was not what Washington wanted, but it was what happened. So we had the Republicans, and they chose Thomas Jefferson. Aaron Burr, a legislator from New York, also ran. He hoped to do well enough in the election to become vice president. The moderates of the Federalist Party chose John Adams. As the nation's first vice president, John Adams had used his office to observe the problems of the new government firsthand. It was natural that when Washington decided not to run for a 3rd term, the Federalists chose Adams as his successor. So Adams won the most votes in the Electoral College, and Jefferson won the vice presidency. So here we have two men from two different political parties. One is president, one is vice president. Because at this time, everybody who ran for president was on one ballot. First place got president, second place got vice president. And you'll see throughout history where there was a problem until it changed, where the president would pick a running mate who would run with them instead of who got elected when. So few presidents come to office as qualified as John Adams. He was a lawyer and a diplomat. He has served in Continental Congress. And he was an minister to France and England. So he had a lot of experience. But on the day that Adams took office, the cheers for Washington were louder than those for Adams. I don't know if anybody would have been able to succeed well following in Washington's footsteps. Washington was such a larger than life man. In the eyes of his country, he could do no wrong. So I don't know anybody that could have come in and had done well in that position. Tears of sadness streamed from people's eyes for the great man who was leaving office, but there was little praise for the man who succeeded him. And Adams and himself didn't make things any better. He made a major mistake when he kept Washington's cabinet rather than naming its own. They were always going to compare him to Washington, regardless of what he did, and he was always going to fall short. He should have brought in his own supporters who were willing to help him. All right, difficulties for President Adams. This is section 4. Section 3 and section 4 is all that you're doing today. So American envoys meet the French agents. Although some Federalists believe that Adams should break with France and perhaps even declare war, he first chose to negotiate with France over their practice of impressment, some of the same things they dealt with England. The French at this time had seized more than 300 American sailors and threatened to hang them. To add to the insult, the French refused to receive Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, the American ambassador to France. So Adams sent John Marshall and Elbridge Gerry to assist Pinckney in trying to negotiate with them. The trio sought a hearing with Talleyrand, the French Minister of Foreign Affairs, but 9 months after seeking the hearing, they had yet to see the man. However, they did meet his 3 agents. The agents implied that the Americans could have recognition if they gave a $250,000 bribe and ensure a $10 million loan for France. He laid out, Adams, still a lawyer at heart, went to Congress to expose this insult to the U.S. He laid out every piece of evidence to an open session of Congress. To protect the 3 American envoys, Adams substituted the letters XYZ for the names of the French agents. Soon the whole episode was dubbed the XYZ affair. France's actions angered Congress, which soon took measures to arm the country for action. Adams called for a stronger Navy, and Congress voted to make the Navy a separate department and to build 40 ships. The most famous of these new ships was the USS Constitution. The USS Constitution is still ranked as a commissioned ship. As such, it is the oldest commissioned warship afloat. It was nicknamed Old Ironsides as a result of its battle with the British Guerriere during the War of 1812. It seemed like the cannonballs was bouncing off their wood sides. Congress tripled the size of the army. Although Congress never actually declared war, the Americans captured 90 French vessels by the fall of 1800. Because some fighting did occur, the conflict is sometimes called a quasi-war. War wasn't actually declared, but there was some fighting. The public cheered the victories and pressured for real war. But Adams was hesitant. He believed that a full-scale war was unwise and the U.S. was not prepared to fight, which is Right. They were not prepared. They were just building up their navy and their army. So they weren't in the position that where they could attack an established country like France. So war ended up actually being able to be avoided. In 1799, Napoleon saw that the U.S. may be a little bit stronger of an enemy than they originally had thought. He grew nervous. In war with England, France's army was defeated and trapped in Egypt. Napoleon was willing to negotiate peace with England. Although Adams wanted Napoleon to pay the damages for France's actions against America, Adams settled for a new agreement called the Convention of 1800. He avoided all-out war, but few of his countrymen recognized the benefit. Displeased Federalists aided with the Republicans and denounced him, but Adams thought the agreement was the single most important contribution to America. He requested that his edifice read, "Here lies John Adams, who took upon himself the responsibility of the peace with France in the year 1800. We're going to look at some of the opposition to Adams, and some of that came about through the Alien and the Sedition Acts. In 1798, the Federalists in Congress passed 4 laws called the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Federalists claimed that the laws would help protect the country during the threat of war, but the Federalists also intended the acts to harm the Republican Party and keep it from gaining power. Adams had not asked for these laws, but he did not oppose them and then signed them into law. First of the laws was the Naturalization Act, and it extended the time that an immigrant had to live in America before he could gain American citizenship. It went from 5 years to 14 years. The next was the Alien Enemies and the Alien Act. They allowed the president to imprison or expel any dangerous foreigners. The law was purposely vague. The terms peace, safety, and war were not defined. Adams, aware of the dangers of the act, never enforced them. And then the Sedition Acts said that any person who said, wrote, or published anything false or malicious against the government or its officials could be fined $2,000 and imprisoned for up to 2 years. The Republicans saw this act as an attempt to stop both their mouths and their pens. They protested that the law violated their freedoms of speech and the press, which were guaranteed by the First Amendment to the Constitution. Although many people were arrested under this law, only 25 of them were brought to trial and just 10 of them were convicted. Opposition to the Alien Sedition Acts. The Republicans and even a few Federalists worked hard to overrule these acts. Republicans James Madison and Thomas Jefferson wrote the Virginia and Kentucky resolution for these 2 states. In this, we begin hearing for the first time about nullification. Each set of the resolutions claimed that the states have the right to interpose themselves between the national government and the people if the national government overreaches its powers. So this term of nullification describes the state's act of declaring void any federal law within its boundaries, basically saying that if a state government doesn't agree with a federal law, they don't have to abide by within their state boundaries. That is the concept of nullification, which you will see over the next several years we're have a lot of problem with in American history. All right, so we're back at election time. Despite their dislike of Adams, the Federalists chose him to run for re-election. They also selected Charles Cotesworth Pinckney of South Carolina to run. The Republicans chose Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. When the votes were counted, Jefferson and Burr both received equal number of votes, more than Adams or Pinckney. But there was no designation that Jefferson was the one who was supposed to be president, because at the time, on election ballots did not state which man was running for which office. The submission had caused a problem in 1796, and it did so again in 1800. Each member of the Electoral College was allowed to cast 2 votes. When the votes were counted, Jefferson and Burr both received equal numbers of votes. So the Constitution states that in a tie, the House of Representatives chooses the president. Each state gets one vote, and the winning candidate must have a majority of vote cast. In 1800, a candidate needed 9 votes to win. Burr, every political opportunist, refused to defer. He would not say that he was running for vice president rather than for president. Many of the Federalists decided to vote for Burr. They believed that if they helped him win, he would later be more favorable for their party. Some people also believe that if there was a deadlock, Adams or Pinckney might win as a compromise candidate. The states voted. Jefferson took 8 states, but he did not get the needed majority. The election dragged on for a week through 35 ballots. Finally, on the 36th ballot, James Bayard of Delaware changed his vote, making Jefferson president. And that's the end of section 4. So that's all you're doing for today. So tomorrow you're going to pick up with section 5, and then you'll review for your test on Wednesday. So you can pause the video here. All right, so now we're going to look at section 5, strengthening the courts. On January 20th, 1981, Adams nominated John Marshall as the new Chief Justice. Oliver Ellsworth, the 3rd Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, experienced major health problems during Adams' term. And when he resigned shortly before Adams left office, it gave him the rare opportunity to appoint a new Chief Justice and extend his influence far beyond his term as president. Marshall looked for ways to increase the Supreme Court's influence. He kept the justices out of political campaigns, which is still a big thing today. Judges and justices are not allowed to take part in political campaigns. Republicans tended to distrust the judicial branch because it was the least democratic of the branches. So John Marshall did a lot to change some of that. He strengthened the court by exercising restraints in his rulings. Let me see how he unified the court by having the justices hold private conferences and by having them issue one opinion to support each decision. It's called the majority opinion. If some justices disagree with the decision, they could write dissenting opinions. Before this time, every judge wrote his own opinion. And when we go back to talking about him exercising restraints in his ruling, this increased Americans' trust in the court and prevented other branches from accusing the court of overreaching. Marshall also made small changes. He set the precedent of having the justices wear plain black robes. The attire seemed to be more democratic and less aristocratic to Americans. 6 days before Adams left office, Congress passed the Judiciary Act of 1801. Until this time, the Supreme Court justices had also served as circuit court judges. The responsibility required them to move from place to place for 8 to 9 months of the year as cases demanded. They handled appeals from federal district courts at various locations. The new act created 16 new circuit judgeships to aid in administration of the law. It also cut the number of Supreme Court justices from 6 to 5 to prevent ties and allows several justices of the peace to be appointed. Because John Adams appointed 58 judges to full-time positions late in the night before he left office, the judges has often been called the midnight judges. The Republicans later repealed the act, but Adams was in the law in naming his judges. Moreover, the Senate had to approve his choices, so he would have his backing for his appointment if the Senate chose to approve them. One of Adams' midnight judges was Federalist William Marbury. He didn't receive his commission before Adams left office, and James Madison, the new Secretary of State, refused to release it. So Marbury sued for his job. He believed that it was Madison's duty to deliver the commission. John Marshall's court decided the case of Marbury v. Madison. Marshall realized that if he ordered Madison to deliver the document, Madison would probably ignore the order. The snub would further weaken the image of the Supreme Court. Although the court held that Marbury was entitled to the commission, it ruled that Madison did not have to deliver the commission. It said that the section of the federal law that granted such power as unconstitutional. This was the first time that the court had reviewed a federal law and declared it unconstitutional. Thus, the court took the power of judicial review, which the Constitution provided for state laws, and applied to the federal laws as well. This was an expansion of the court's power. Despite the favorable decision in Marbury v. Madison, Jefferson probably would have challenged Marshall's use of judicial review in later cases. He did not want Marshall to increase the power of either the national government or the court. However, the court did not assert judicial review again until 1857 in Dred Scott v. Sanford. All right, so that is the end of our chapter 8. So you're going to review now with Ms. Wise using quizzes, and your test is tomorrow. So I hope to see you soon and do well. Thank y'all.